This episode of California Dreaming is brought to you by Blubrry. Blubrry offers the best media hosting, accurate listening stats, and their all-new PowerPress Deluxe sites, a no-setup WordPress website for your podcast, and it comes with all of the necessary links to share your show with the world built right in. Head over to www.orbitaljigsaw.com/dream to sign up for media hosting, a PowerPress Deluxe site, get that podcast you've been dreaming about started, and get your first month for free. That's www.orbitaljigsaw.com/dream. And before we move on to today's show, I recently had the pleasure of talking to and getting to know Mike Morford, co-host of the hugely popular Criminology podcast. And if you already haven't listened, Criminology is a podcast that examines one case per season. Mike, along with Mike Ferguson, co-host of True Crime All the Time and True Crime All the Time Unsolved, dive deep into each case that they cover, bringing you the most intricate details, things you may not have ever heard about some of the most infamous cases out there. The first season covered the unsolved case of the Zodiac Killer, and they are currently into their second season, which is delving into the unsolved crimes of the East Area Rapist, also known as the original Night Stalker or the Golden State Killer. As you can see, Mike and Mike obviously have a thing for California crime, which is, of course, my favorite topic. Let's hear from them about their fabulous show.
This is Mike Ferguson.
And this is Mike Morford.
And we just want to let everybody know that our podcast, Criminology, is back for season 2.
We'll be covering the case of the East Area Rapist, Golden State Killer, responsible for over 50 rapes and a dozen murders throughout California.
And we're going to get into every detail of this predator that terrorized California from 1976 to 1986.
This predator needs to be identified.
So check out Criminology. The first episode of season 2 comes out on February 24th.
You can find Criminology on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or your favorite podcast app.
Make sure to check them out if you already haven't. And now, on to today's show. Way back in episode 2 of California Dreaming, I brought you a story entitled The Tale of the Fathers, where we talked about a rash of murder-suicides that rocked the Korean-American community of Los Angeles in a span of about 8 days. The common thread in each of those situations, all of which involved instances of domestic violence of the worst kind, each father became too overwhelmed or too distraught over financial or marital hardships that they were facing and decided that the best way to solve all of their problems was to eliminate their families in order to end the suffering. As I was researching that story, I wondered about the cultural implications of the act of murder-suicide, how maybe the shame and dishonor was much too much to bear, and if the father, the head of the household, were to take only his life in an act of suicide and left his family behind to try and pick up the pieces of the wreckage he left behind, that they would be faced with the added indignity of a dad having taken his own life, and that would disgrace the family name. So, the best solution was to take them all with him. I didn't really buy into that at the time, and I still don't. To me, wiping out your entire family because you couldn't deal can't be justified. But in the broad spectrum of the crimes that we look at, the person who decides to take their own life, but also the lives of their families while in the process, it can sometimes come with feelings of sadness, knowing how utterly desperate and hopeless that person was feeling in that moment. The shame of whatever had been going on in their lives, the loss of a job that leads to financial troubles. These people don't just snap. There was a long road to reaching that point of committing the ultimate crimes against one's own family, likely accompanied by issues of mental illness. A good example was recently outlined in an episode of the Dark Poutine podcast. Just did an episode about Canadian professional wrestler Chris Benoit, who did just this. He killed his family and himself in 2007. It was an excellent look into his story. If you have a chance to listen to that, I'd highly recommend it. Today, I'm not going to tell you another story about a murder-suicide committed by a dad. I am going to tell you the tale of a man who did want to rid himself of his wife and his daughter, but he certainly had no interest in ending his own life. Not at all. And this is not going to be an easy story to tell for a number of reasons. The man at the center of the story is a very, very complicated figure, and I feel myself already having a difficult time to convey to you how intricate his story is going to be. Another reason is because there isn't very much out there in the media regarding this case. There's a spattering of a few news articles, a couple of videos, and there is a book about the story entitled Checklist for Murder, written by author Anthony Flacco. And his telling of the story is done so well that I am challenging myself to make sure I find a way to convey this story to you in my own way. In today's episode of California Dreaming, the tale of Father Dearest. On April 30th, 1992, does that date ring a bell to you guys? It jumped out at me right away also. Remember a few episodes back, the tale of Los Angeles burning? April 30th, 1992 marked day 2 of the Los Angeles riots. Obviously, while the attention of Southern California and much of the state, possibly the country, was focused on the rioting that was unfolding, there was another story coming to an end a few miles away in the San Fernando Superior Court that none of us were paying attention to. Even if the riots weren't simultaneously going on, none of us would have been privy to the closed court session anyway. A 23-year-old woman named Natasha Peernock Sims was in the process of winning a civil suit that she had filed the previous September. A suit filed against her father, a man, at the time 54 years old, named Robert J. Peernock. The amount awarded? $11 million in damages. I know what you're thinking. What in the holy heck did this man do? Or even more curious, what in the world did Natasha have to live through in order to see this day in court? In contrast, since I've mentioned the Los Angeles riots, brought about by the acquittal of those 4 officers who beat motorist Rodney King nearly to death, he went on to win a civil lawsuit of his own for the beating that he endured at the hands of those officers in the amount of $3.8 million. If what Rodney endured was worth $3.8 million, what do you imagine Natasha must have had to endure in order to be awarded almost 3 times that amount, $11 million? I don't know how the court decides what monetary amount to put on pain and suffering, but here's the thing to remember when thinking about these 2 civil cases. Rodney's award was against Los Angeles, the LAPD, those officers who used excessive force when arresting him. Natasha's award was against her father. That fact, in and of itself, takes her story to a whole other level. And I am going to walk you through the entire ordeal Natasha was made to endure that brought about this $11 million civil lawsuit settlement. In some versions of the stories you might be able to find on this particular crime, some of the names of the individuals involved have been changed here and there for obvious reasons. And if there are some questions as to the accuracy of anyone's names, I will point those out as we go along. But the people who are at the core of the story, the main characters, I guess you could say, those names are accurate. Robert J. Peernock was born circa 1937. Isn't that weird nowadays to not know the exact date of someone's birth? I guess it's still possible, but right off the bat, it makes me think that there's something suspect about this guy already. I don't know why, and it really doesn't mean anything, but I find it to be mysterious and intriguing nonetheless. He was from Tarzana, which is a part of the San Fernando Valley area of Los Angeles. He had previously worked as a pyrotechnic engineer, as well as having worked for the state of California with the Department of Water Resources. It was a position that he held that he would later claim was responsible for the crimes for which he would go on to be accused of, and you'll understand more about that as we go along. At approximately 4:30 in the morning, on July 22nd, 1987, there was a vehicle that crashed into a utility pole just off to the side of a highway on a desolate stretch of road in the San Fernando Valley, north of Los Angeles. The crash itself caused the utility pole to fall over, and the car was a huge, black 1971 two-door Cadillac. You can see pictures of the vehicle if you Google Peernock's name, which is spelled Peernock. A Samaritan passing by noticed the crashed vehicle and pulled off the highway to see if its occupants were in need of any type of assistance. The closer he got to the car, it became very apparent that there was a very strong odor of gasoline emanating from the vehicle. He could also see that there was something underneath the car that was smoldering, causing smoke to rise up from beneath the car. Upon closer inspection, he was able to ascertain that there was at least one person in the vehicle who appeared to be unconscious and not moving. The man became alarmed, and this was 1987 and there were no cell phones at the ready. You basically had to have a lot of money to have one, and even at the time, the more common thing to have was a car phone. So he looked around and found the closest home that he could find. He alerted the residents as to the car accident and the victim injured at the scene, so the homeowner quickly dialed 911 for help. A few minutes later, paramedics arrived at the site of the crash, and the first thing that jumped out at them as well was the strong odor of gasoline coming from the vehicle. But they noticed something that the first gentleman who happened upon the accident didn't see, that there wasn't just one injured person in the vehicle. There were two. The woman in the driver's seat was examined first by paramedics, but sadly, it was too late. She was pronounced dead. They examined the passenger, and she appeared to be much younger than the driver, and she was miraculously still alive, but barely hanging on to life. One of the first things first responders were able to determine was a fact that they found very troubling. The odor of gasoline, it wasn't actually coming from the gas tank. That was intact and pretty much undamaged. Fuel was not leaking from it. The smell of gasoline was coming from inside the vehicle, as not only had the entire interior of the car been doused in gasoline, so had each of the women seated in the front seats. They too were doused. This, along with the fact that the car seemed to be smoldering, they knew they had to at least get the passenger who was still clinging to life away from the vehicle as quickly as possible, as firefighters were not there yet at the scene to take care of the potentially deadly hazard. That vehicle at any moment could burst into flames with the amount of gasoline and vapors emanating from it. Police were next to arrive, and it was imperative that they try to do what they could to get any kind of information from the survivor of the crash. She was hanging on, but if she died, then anything that she would have to offer would be lost forever. They were able to see this girl, aside from being covered in gas, had sustained extremely traumatic wounds to her head. She was slipping back and forth, in and out of consciousness. Police asked her some simple questions, but the only word that emerged from her at the time was the name Patty. I will explain who Patty is, but she is not Patty, and the woman in the driver's seat isn't either. We have all heard police say that while conducting interviews, when talking about suspicious or questionable car accidents, they will often allude to the fact that they've been to the scenes of many a car crash, and they can almost tell right away when something doesn't look right. And this car accident into the utility pole was definitely one of them. Starting with all of the gasoline all over the inside of the vehicle, as well as all over the victims, this certainly raised some red flags, as that did not happen as a result of this crash. There was no way gasoline spilled into the passenger area of that car. It was evident that someone doused it and its occupants. Beyond that, there was more about the crash that had investigators scratching their heads. There was something suspicious about the crash scene. As a matter of fact, there were several suspicious somethings, starting with the gas. After having had a chance to take a closer look at the injuries of the driver of the car, investigators were able to tell that her injuries were way too extensive and way too severe to have been associated with any kind of car accident. But this one in particular, which was relatively minor. The car really only had minor damage when it ran into the pole. If this had been a high-speed crash, and if she had been wearing a seatbelt, which, even then, back when cars only had the lap belts available minus the shoulder belts, I mean, there might have been a shoulder belt. I'd have to research that a little bit more, but my dad, when he was alive, he used to restore old cars, and many of them only had lap belts. So even if this was an accident that occurred at a high rate of speed, and they hit that pole, the laws of physics would dictate that both passengers would have likely been thrown into, if not through, the windshield, causing severe wounds to the head or forehead or face, right? Well, guess what? The windshield was in pristine condition. Nothing had flown into that windshield. Not the passengers, not anything else. So what of those massive head wounds then? If they didn't hit their heads in the car, where did they hit their heads? Or, better question, who may have hit them in the head to cause all that damage? It was still early in the investigation to jump to any conclusions just yet. Investigators took a look at the inside of the car as well, looking for damage there to see if there was any indication that the passengers may have slammed into any part of the interior, thereby causing those head injuries. But one look at the dashboard and the steering column, it was clear that no impact had occurred there either. The steering wheel was completely intact. As a matter of fact, when the crime scene investigators dusted the steering wheel for fingerprints, guess what? No fingerprints at all. Nothing. Not even a smudge. Is that possible? Yeah, I suppose that's happened someplace in the world, but for there to be none at all was a surprise. And this automatically led investigators to believe that the wheel had been wiped clean. And that wasn't all the odd findings inside the vehicle. Crime scene investigators discovered there to be copious amounts of blood all over the backseat of the car. One of the detectives on the scene described the blood as massive and all over the seats. This had investigators wondering why, if there were only 2 passengers in the vehicle, would one of them be riding in the back seat then? And if she wasn't in the back seat, how did she become so injured as to spill that amount of blood there in a seemingly minor accident such as this? There really wouldn't have been anything back there for her to smash her head on in a crash that would have caused those nearly fatal head wounds that she had sustained. And there was more evidence to be found that pointed to foul play and away from this being just a car accident. Investigators found some items in the trunk of the Cadillac that appeared to have been recently set fire to. Remember, there was smoke emanating from the vehicle when it was first discovered crashed by that passerby. This seemed to have something to do with that. So, what does all of this mean? There's more to this smoldering stuff to come in a little bit, and I'll get to that once we're done with the evidence inside the vehicle. Investigators also discovered that inside the car, tossed into the floorboard, was an empty bottle of hard liquor. I read one report that it was whiskey, and I read another one that it was bourbon, but either way, it was hard liquor. This bottle did have fingerprints on it, but there was, again, something very bizarre about those fingerprints. They were in blood. Okay, so what does this mean? That somehow after becoming mortally or close to mortally wounded, one of these passengers decided that they needed to take one last drink? I seriously doubt it. What if... Oops, did you guys hear that? When I said I seriously, it activated my Hey Siri. Maybe I need to turn that feature off while I'm recording. Anyway, what the bloody fingerprints indicate is that those prints were applied to the bottle after the person handling it was bleeding. So one of these women is bleeding out about the head so profusely, but for some reason attempted to handle that liquor bottle? Or perhaps reached for it or touched it at some point after their car crashed? Or is the likely answer that someone attempted to plant some incriminating evidence in the car by making it look like the woman driving the car was under the influence, and in doing so attempted to place her hand on the bottle, thereby leaving those bloody fingerprints? It goes without saying that the fact that those prints are bloody is suspect. Investigators were also able to locate a handbag in the vehicle. The identification inside belonged to a woman named Claire Peernock. She was 45 years old. So they came to the conclusion that she was one of the two women found in the car, likely the older woman. It would later be determined that Claire was the apparent driver of the car. Not only that, it was also determined that it was she who left those suspicious bloody fingerprints on that liquor bottle. The passenger in the car was later identified as the 18-year-old daughter of the driver, Natasha Peernock. She had been rushed to the hospital so her injuries could be tended to. As the sole survivor of this crash, investigators were desperately hoping that she would pull through. They weren't sure, though. She was in terrible shape. Aside from her physical injuries, toxicology tests were taken upon her arrival at the hospital, and she was found to have large quantities of alcohol and drugs in her system. So naturally, when she was first rushed into the emergency room, barely hanging on to life, the attending hospital personnel first thought that this was a result of a drunk driving incident. Emergency room doctors and nurses probably see these sorts of tragedies on a regular basis. Nobody working in the emergency room that morning could have ever known how much more disturbing the truth behind the supposed car accident actually was. When investigators brought in a tow truck to the scene to take the vehicle in for further processing, as it was being hoisted onto the bed of the truck, they made even more suspicious finds on the undercarriage of the car. There was a piece of cotton rope tied to the frame of it, relatively close to the gas tank. I guess the best way to describe it in this case is that it appeared to be a wick of some sort, because this piece of rope was partially burned. There were burn marks on the gas tank too, carbon deposits that were left after something was burning close to it. Those carbon deposits were left there when that rope was set fire to and was actively burning right next to that gas tank under the car. It doesn't take a genius to begin to put the pieces of this case together and realize that this is starting to look like a setup, a staged car accident, one that epically failed. I mean, come on, with all of that gasoline doused inside the car, the smoldering materials in the trunk, the burning wick underneath the vehicle right next to the gas tank, and the car still didn't burst into flames? Yep, fail. The car was towed to what was known as the Scientific Investigation Division Lab, or SID, now known as the Forensic Science Division, for more testing. A few hours after the crash, the local media began to report that Claire Peernock was killed when she lost control of her car and crashed into a utility pole. But keeping their findings close to the vest, investigators were beginning to put the pieces of a puzzle together that was telling a very different story, one that was much more nefarious than what the media was putting out there. This, of course, is probably for the best that the media not catch too much wind as to what was really going on in the investigation, as we just talked about a couple weeks ago in the Philip DiMartino case. Investigators obviously think that this was a staged car crash. So that means that there is somebody out there that caused this to happen, and it was crystal clear that this staged accident was meant to kill, or at least cover up the killing of these two victims, and one of them survived. Investigators must keep their facts out of the media as best they can, as they do have a survivor, which means they have a witness that somebody out there has tried to murder. Investigators made their way over to the hospital where Natasha had been taken to see if it were possible to get any kind of information out of her. They still weren't sure if she was going to make it or not, so naturally they were anxious to get what they could from her, just in case she didn't. When they did see her, she was drifting in and out of consciousness still. She had sustained massive wounds to her head, and not to mention the fact that her system was still imbued with alcohol and drugs. So at first, Natasha was largely incoherent. She appeared to be confused and had difficulty putting together into words what she wanted to say. They were trying to listen to her, to see if she had any information to give them, doing what they could to make sense of what she was trying to say, as everything was coming out in bits and fragments. What was for certain, though, Natasha kept trying to tell them something about her dad. She was repeating the words, my dad, and she was aware that her mother did not survive the crash, but through it all, continued to mention her dad. What did this mean to investigators? Was she asking for her dad? It seems like the natural person to be asking for, knowing that mom is no longer alive, right? Natasha's injured. She's in the hospital. She's in a great deal of pain. She's confused, and she's asking for her dad. Makes sense, doesn't it? Yeah, under normal circumstances it would. But these were not normal circumstances. Not even close. Investigators knew that they needed to begin looking for Natasha's dad, Robert Peernock. Now, at the same time, they were very well aware that somebody tried to kill Natasha, and they succeeded in killing Claire. They were very worried that the killer responsible for this might attempt to locate Natasha and finish the job. So a police officer was posted up outside the door of her hospital room just to make sure she's kept safe. Later on that same day, police received a phone call from a man who said he wanted to file a missing persons report for his wife. And guess who that was? One Robert J. Peernock. Officers speaking to him on the phone knew immediately who he was. The husband of the deceased victim found in the crash car, Claire Peernock, and the father of the survivor, Natasha. They wanted Peernock to come down to the station so he could provide them with a formal statement. But they did break the news to him about his family over the phone. He seemed to sound upset on the line, and he did agree to come down to the station to give his statement, agreeing to help in any way that he could, telling them that it wouldn't be a problem and he would be down there shortly. But investigators really didn't have time to wait around for Peernock to show up to give his statement. He didn't give a clear time frame for when he'd be there, and they honestly had no time to waste. Investigators had received some preliminary information regarding Claire's death, and it was apparent that she had been struck repeatedly with a blunt object. The wounds to her head appeared to be in a cluster on her forehead, which indicated that she was not moving very much, if at all, when these blows were being delivered, meaning that she was in such a way that she wasn't attempting to defend herself or move away from the attack. Those repeated blows to the forehead caused her skull to shatter, causing her death. Blunt force trauma to the head. So for investigators, they had a killer to find. But in order to do so, they really needed to try and find out some information about their victims, Claire and Natasha. What was going on in their lives that would cause someone to want to do them harm such as this? Why would someone want to do this? What was the motive? If they could answer those questions, they might be able to get closer to figuring out who could have done something like this. In conducting somewhat of a cursory background investigation into the Peernock family, they really didn't find anything alarming at first. Claire and Robert appeared to be the relatively average married couple. She was a stay-at-home mom, and Peernock worked in the movie and television industry as a special effects technician. In order to find out more information about the couple, investigators first talked to some of Peernock's neighbors. There was one thing that several of the neighbors, upon hearing about what happened to Claire, pointed out to investigators: that Claire never drove at night, that she never drove that car, and she was never one to really drink that much alcohol. Of that, all of them were certain. And as for the drinking, at most, they'd known her to, on the rarest of special occasions, partake in a glass of wine. Investigators were already suspicious of the crash and the whiskey or bourbon bottle found in the car. So, in talking to the neighbors familiar with the Peernocks, it only confirmed their suspicions. There was no way that Claire would drive that vehicle. There was no way that she would drive that vehicle at night. There was no way that she would drive that vehicle at night under the influence. And there was absolutely no way she would do all of that with her daughter in the car with her. Neighbors were like, no way, not Claire. And then, as that day came to an end, it became apparent that there was something more going on, as Robert Peernock never showed up to give his formal statement, as he had promised. Meanwhile, as the vehicle was being further processed by SID, experts were meticulously taking the car apart, looking for more evidence. They were particularly interested in that piece of rope that I told you about earlier that had been seen hanging underneath the car, tied near the gas tank that looked as though it had been burnt. I mentioned that it looked like a fuse or a wick of some sort, and that was its intended purpose, but it obviously didn't work. Upon closer inspection of the undercarriage of the vehicle, it was discovered that the burnt piece of rope was actually tied to a sharp piece of metal that was attached to the axle of the car with some bolts. The spiked end of that metal bar was positioned approximately 1 inch away from the gas tank. This more than confirmed for investigators that the crash was a setup and the car was rigged with these implements. Whoever put this together had this idea to cause this vehicle to crash at a high rate of speed, and that the force of the impact was supposed to cause that metal spike to be thrust into the gas tank, thereby piercing it, causing gasoline to spill out of it. The piece of rope was lit prior to setting the vehicle in motion, and this was supposed to have either been on fire or at least smoldering at the time that the gas tank would be punctured, causing the vehicle to burst into flames and possibly even explode. And that would, in turn, burn up all the evidence inside the car, all the blood, the victims, any fingerprint evidence there might have been. Everything that was suspicious or out of place would have potentially been destroyed. And Natasha would have probably not survived if the gas tank had been punctured and the vehicle had been ignited. I will talk about how this plan was foiled in just a bit. I first wanted to back up for a minute and discuss how Natasha and Claire ended up in that crash off that highway that night. The afternoon before the crash on July 21st, 1987, at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Natasha was dropped off at her house by Patty. Remember that name Natasha had uttered at the scene of the crash? That was the name of her friend, as she was saying, Patty. Now, for the sake of the story, I've not really been able to confirm that Patty is her friend's real name or not, so we're just going to call this good friend of hers Patty. So Patty was able to ascertain that Natasha's dad was at the house when she dropped her off. The thing is, Peernock did not live in the home with Natasha and her mother. As a matter of fact, he hadn't really lived there for nearly 4 years. But when they pulled up and they saw his car parked in front of the home, Patty grew concerned. She knew Natasha had a very strained relationship with her father as a result of a history of physical abuse by him that she and her mom had suffered for years. He was actually living with a girlfriend and had been carrying on an affair with for quite some time, a woman named Sonia, and she is another name that I'm not sure if that's her accurate name or not, but for the sakes of the story, we will call her Sonia. And I will talk about her a little bit more too. You see, the marriage between Claire and Peernock had been over for quite some time. However, it was only a year prior to her death that she had sought out a divorce attorney. There were assets that would need to be divided up in the event that they would divorce, and if you're beginning to sense that Peernock was not interested in splitting assets with Claire, then you would be correct. But when Peernock realized his wife was going through with the divorce, he wanted to buy himself some time. So after he had learned that she had seen a divorce attorney and filed, he stepped in and asked her to hold off. He convinced her that if she waited, he had some business or financial dealings in the works, and to give him the time to finalize those things that he had going on, it would be financially beneficial for both of them in the end. So Claire had agreed to postpone her filing for divorce, and they had even had a written contract that he was willing to put his signature on as a sign of good faith that he was going to keep his promises to follow through with the divorce at the end of the set period of time that he was asking for. And part of the agreement was that he would continue to not live in the family home, but he would be allowed to access the home as needed. Also, now wait to hear this part of the agreement. I had indicated that Peernock had physically abused Claire and Natasha in the past, right? There was even an incident where Natasha had tried to step in on a fight that her parents were having, and when she did, her dad threw her into a wall and dislocated her shoulder. She was even hospitalized for a while. But the official story to the hospital staff and friends was that she fell. So anyway, part of this written agreement was that Peernock promised during this grace period the contract had stipulated for him to get his business and financial affairs in order, that he would not physically or verbally harm or abuse both Claire and Natasha. Yeah, that was actually part of the contract, to promise not to harm them. Unbelievable. Well, I don't think that I have to tell you guys that this time Peernock was buying for himself wasn't so that he could make some sort of business moves to provide a more beneficial divorce settlement for Claire. It was to buy him some more time to do some nefarious planning. Fortunately for Claire, she made one of the best decisions in all of this. She provided her attorney with a copy of that signed agreement. Later on, it would paint a clear picture as to the goings-on behind the closed doors in the Peernock family home. So back to the afternoon before the crash. Patty was dropping Natasha off at her house. The girls had plans to go out later that night, but Natasha had a few chores that she needed to finish up before her mom got home. And when she was done, Natasha would come back and pick her up so they could go out. But when they saw Peernock's car parked in front of the house, Patty grew concerned and wanted to go inside with Natasha. But she told Patty that everything was fine and to just go home and she would see her later. So, reluctantly, Patty left. Natasha prepared herself something to eat in the kitchen, and then she would get started on the chores that she'd had. But as she was eating, her dad approached her and started giving her a hard time about coming into the house and finding all of the lights on and that this was causing the electricity bill to be really high. This conversation escalated into a verbal argument, and then it turned physical, with Peernock putting his hands around Natasha's neck, and he began choking her until she almost lost consciousness. He released his grip and then told her that he had something for her. Reeling from just having been choked out by her dad, she didn't move. He momentarily left the room, and when he came back, she saw that he had a gun, a pair of handcuffs, rope, and something that appeared to be some sort of black bag. She was too scared to move. He restrained her with the handcuffs and the rope, and the black bag, well, that was a hood with a drawstring. It had no holes for the eyes or nose, but it had a small cut where her mouth was to be. She asked her dad if he was going to kill her, and he told her, "Yeah, I'm planning on it." He took Natasha into her mom's room and laid her on the bed. He then proceeded to insert a tube through that cut in the black hood over her head, force the tube into her mouth, and for the next couple of hours, while he was waiting for Claire to arrive home, he poured hard liquor down into the tube, forcing Natasha to swallow it. If she'd attempted to spit it out or refused to swallow, he would either hit her or threaten to kill her with the gun. He also removed the hood several times and ordered her to swallow some pills he'd given her. She did not know what those pills were, and I don't think it was ever really determined what they were, but they were some kind of opiates or downers. Natasha began teetering, in and out of consciousness. Patty came back to pick up Natasha. She knocked on the door, but there was no answer. She could see that everyone's cars were still parked outside, so it seemed that everyone should still have been there. It was unusual for Natasha not to keep the plans that they'd had. She knocked harder, but still, no answer, and she could hear no sounds coming from inside. She had a hard time believing that nobody was there, and she knew that because the house was so small, no matter where they were inside there, they could certainly hear her knocking. She went around to the side of the house where she knew Natasha had been able to get in if she were ever locked out, and she peered inside the home to see if anyone was in there, and she was about to go inside. She wanted to go inside, but she suddenly got this really bad feeling that overwhelmed her about Natasha's dad. And she thought better of it and decided not to enter the home. And she left. Even though Patty would go on to experience a great deal of regret for not taking more action that day, there simply wasn't any way she could have known the terror that Peernock was inflicting upon his daughter just inside. Personally, I'm relieved that she didn't go in. Who knows what he would have done to her as well. While Patty was knocking, Peernock was holding a gun to Natasha, whispering at her to stay quiet. The next time Natasha kind of felt herself coming back into consciousness, she was sort of startled by the loud sound of a thud. She couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it seemed close. Remember, she's got that hood on, and she's been plied with drugs and alcohol. She would soon discover that the noise she heard was the sound of her mother's body hitting the ground. He'd done the same thing to Claire with the bindings, the hood, the alcohol, and this too went on for hours. But Natasha was far too inebriated to have any much awareness of time or what was going on. And once Peernock was satisfied that the two were blacked out from the drugs and alcohol, it was time for him to finish them off. His next order of business was to attack Claire and Natasha with the tire iron. He proceeded to beat both of them repeatedly about the head with the weapon, causing those blunt force trauma injuries they were later discovered to have. For Claire, when she was beaten by Peernock, it appeared to investigators that she never put up a fight or attempted to defend herself from the blows from that tire iron, as every single blow landed squarely on her head and basically in the same place, essentially crushing in her skull. She never moved throughout the duration of that beating. Next up was Natasha, but she wasn't as passed out as her mother was. Once the blows from that tire iron began, she was able to put up somewhat of a fight for her life and attempted to defend herself from the tire iron. This was evident in the blunt force trauma injuries to her head, that they were scattered, that they all did not land in the same place, and she was able to move about as the blows came down. This caused the injuries to her skull to be more spread out, and therefore they did not cause as severe damage to her skull or her brain. Beaten and in a fog of alcohol and drugs still, Natasha and her mom were moved out of the room and placed into the back seat of her dad's old 1971 Cadillac. By this time, the effects of the drugs and alcohol had worn off just enough for Natasha to have some level of awareness of what was going on around her, despite the fact that she still had that hood on over her head. She could tell by the texture of the seats that she was lying on that she was inside her dad's car. She could feel and sense and smell that her mom was laying next to her, and she could hear her mom still breathing. She wasn't moving, and she wasn't crying. She wasn't saying anything, but she was breathing. Peernock got into the driver's seat of the car and made that 15-minute or so drive to that desolate area in the San Fernando Valley near that freeway. This was somewhat of an industrial area. There were some railroad tracks that passed through, but for the most part, especially at this time of night, there was nobody around at all. This was the place that Peernock had carefully chosen to stage that car crash in an attempt to make this look like an accident. The reason he picked this place was because there was a hill that led to a T-shaped intersection. His plan was to send that car down that hill, and at the bottom of it was a concrete barricade that the car would roll directly into and set off that chain reaction explosion that he'd rigged we talked about earlier. The burning rope and that metal spike aimed at the gas tank. And I also told you that his plan was a fail. And I'll explain why, in spite of all of his planning, all this time thinking that he is so brilliant, that this was going to basically be a piece of cake because he thinks he's some sort of genius and he has this all figured out. Well, I hate to break it to you, Peernock, but you're not as smart as you think you are. And actually, you're kind of dumb if you thought you were going to get away with this absurd plan. When I tell you what went wrong, I'm pretty sure you're going to find it laughable. Let me explain. When Peernock rigged up his Cadillac with that cutter bar aimed at the gas tank with intentions of exploding the car and hopefully destroying all of the evidence of the vicious assault he'd committed against his wife and daughter, this plan was months in the making, and the location was specifically chosen by him believing it to be the perfect location to stage this accident. But there was one thing that he did not plan on: that vehicle veering off course. He had even apparently had the wheels aligned just to make sure that when he set that vehicle in motion, that it would stay on course. But it didn't. It never made it head-on into that concrete barrier he had aimed it at. Instead, the car went to the right and hit that utility pole, never reaching its full velocity. You see, the roads are usually paved in such a way that they curve from the middle in order for rain to drain off the pavement. So even if he had set the car to propel down the middle of the crown of the street, he couldn't control the forces of gravity pulling it either to the left or to the right. That was the one thing he could not control. The author of the book on this story, Checklist for Murder, Anthony Flacco, floated an alternative theory as to why the vehicle may have veered off course. When Peernock pulled over and prepared to send that car downhill and into the concrete barrier, he'd actually tied Claire sitting upright to the steering wheel. I guess he wanted to make sure that it looked like she was driving, and he figured all of the restraints would be burned up when the car ignited. Well, Anthony Flacco thought perhaps that when Peernock rigged the accelerator and threw that car into drive, that Claire's body began slumping over, causing the wheel to turn and the car to veer to the right. Another theory he had was that there was a chance that Claire was still alive at this point, and this was her last act in an effort to save her daughter's life. It may never be known for certain why the car didn't stay on course. What we do know is Natasha is alive because of it. And there is one more detail about the car crash I need to mention. Another thing Peernock forgot to calculate. Remember I said that there were some burnt pieces of some sort in the trunk? It was something intended to help move the fire along when the gas ignited. Well, I told you that the car crash into the utility pole did not produce enough force to drive that metal cutter into the gas tank. But guess what? It was enough force to jar the spare tire loose in the trunk, which caused it to slip off its platform and onto the fire that he had lit in there, effectively smothering it. So police were still trying to find out more information about the Peernock family in an effort to dig up a motive as to why someone would want to do this to Claire and Natasha. Remember, Peernock said he was going to come in for a formal statement to the police station, but he failed to show up. So investigators began taking a closer look at the family. They had spoken to the neighbors, but they wanted to find out more. When speaking to close friends and family, they made it known that the marriage was in deep trouble, and the couple were headed for divorce that was certain to be bitter and contentious. They told investigators that the couple had a great deal of assets and property, and they knew Peernock was going to fight splitting the assets with Claire tooth and nail, and there was no settlement that would be satisfactory to him. He wanted everything. This definitely pointed to a motive, but it certainly wasn't proof that Peernock killed his wife and tried to kill his daughter. But then they found out another little tidbit of information that heightens their suspicions of Peernock even more. They learned that Claire had a $1 million life insurance policy that he was the sole beneficiary of. Then investigators found out about the mistress, Sonia. I mentioned her earlier. Peernock was ready to move on with her, but did part of that involve him getting rid of his wife, getting rid of his daughter, making away with all their marital assets and property, get that $1 million in life insurance to boot, all with Sonia waiting in the wings? That's what investigators needed to find out. This stuff was all circumstantial. They really wanted to find some physical evidence linking him to the crime scene. And most importantly, they needed to actually find the guy. They hadn't been able to reach him since he'd called in to report his wife missing, promising to come in for that statement and never did. Investigators had a hunch and started poring over some of that video surveillance in the hospital corridor outside Natasha's room, and lo and behold, Those cameras captured him trolling around in the hallway. And then they see him head straight for her room. But when he sees that guard standing at her door, he gets spooked and takes off. Thank goodness those officers had the foresight to post that guard there. Can you imagine if he made his way into her room? I have no doubt that he would have the audacity to try and finish the job. It's possible that he went there maybe to see if he could talk to her, to convince her not to tell police that it was he who did this, but I seriously doubt it. That's giving Peernock way too much credit. To me, this was a very dangerous man who would stop at nothing to see his daughter dead. 2 days after having nearly died in that car crash, Natasha finally woke up and had a chance to tell her story to investigators. And it was harrowing and terrifying. She recounted all of the details of what happened to her that afternoon before the crash. Everything that I described for you, she was able to describe for them in remarkable detail. Considering everything that she was put through, the alcohol, the drugs, the beating with that tire iron, being doused in gasoline, none of it affected her memories of the ordeal. Investigators were then coming to the horrifying realization that when she was first brought to the hospital, when she was saying, my dad, she wasn't asking for him. She was warning them it was him who did this. She went on to tell them that she does not want to see her dad, that he hates her and wants her dead. She also told them about the fear she and her mom lived under for years because of his physical abuse. Detectives are taken aback, as they would say it themselves. They never had a case where a father would do this to his own flesh and blood. So with Natasha's statement, Peernock went from person of interest to prime suspect in the murder of his wife and the attempted murder of his daughter. As much evidence as investigators had against Peernock, they still needed to link him to the crime physically. For the sake of Natasha, it was imperative that they made their case stick. They had no doubt that Natasha's life depended on that. They began by identifying Peernock's girlfriend and placed her under 24-hour surveillance. They were convinced that she was in touch with him, and he might just show up where she was at, or she might just let something slip. They still don't know where he is. Investigators obtained and executed a search warrant at Peernock's home. In his garage, they spotted a length of rope that kind of looked like the rope that they found tied to the undercarriage of the car. They also noticed something oddly missing. They found an outline of where a vise used to be bolted to a workbench. It's strange, right? Why would a vise be recently removed? That's just one of those things that never gets moved. My dad had one in his garage, bolted to his workbench, for as long as I can remember, probably long before he even had me. And I cannot think of any occasion that he would be compelled to remove it unless it were broken or something, and then he would immediately replace it with another. Investigators are thinking that that vise was used to bend and fashion that metal cutter that was bolted to the axle of the car, and he got rid of it to hide evidence linking him to that crime. Okay, but why keep the rope? Oh yeah, because all that stuff was supposed to burn up, right? Right. Inside the house, investigators quickly learned that Peernock is one of those types that keeps his paperwork. Everything, including notes and lists. They packed it all up and marked it as evidence. But, oddly, it wouldn't be until some 4 years later, when the trial was approaching, that they actually decided to comb through Peernock's pile of papers. You see, he was a list maker, and he was quite meticulous about it, even including the smallest of details. Luckily for investigators, he put dates on his lists also, and he crossed things off as he went along. They were able to find some pretty interesting lists dated around the time that they believe he began plotting Claire's and Natasha's murders until the time he actually tried to pull it off. The list had things written on them like cap, jacket, flashlight, rope, gas, tire replacement, liquor in a bottle, rags, tissue, handcuffs, face mask, gloves, motor oil, check purse, keys, and find location. Quite the shopping list, isn't it? Luckily, they were discovered just in time to be admitted as evidence into trial, as they most certainly point to the planning that went into this crime. Based on Natasha's account of what happened to her and her mom, investigators were certain that there would be signs of blood in their house, specifically in the room where he had beat them about the head with that tire iron. With what Natasha had described, there should have been blood everywhere. They went to their home to take a look around. At first glance, there didn't seem to be any signs that a violent beating took place in the home anywhere. Suspecting Peernock may have cleaned up the blood, the specialists from SID were called in to see what they could find. They sprayed the areas with luminol, and under an alternate light source, the room lit up like a Christmas tree. There was evidence of high-velocity blood splatter everywhere, all over the room. And there was no doubt that this was the scene where the brutal beating of Claire and Natasha took place. That was all the probable cause that investigators needed to have a warrant signed for the arrest of Robert J. Peernock. But for now, he remained elusive. 1 week after the car crash, investigators were alerted to a very important piece of evidence: Peernock's vehicle. The car had actually been parked near Los Angeles International Airport for several days and was beginning to receive citations. When it was finally linked to Peernock, investigators headed over to see what sorts of things might be found inside. When they opened the trunk, they found a plethora of evidence. Very incriminating stuff. Among the items they found in the trunk, bags of ammunition, 2 handguns, and you know what else? That missing vise. They knew immediately that if they could get that down to the lab and match it to the tool marks on that metal cutter, then this would directly connect Peernock to the crime scene. SID performed the tool mark analysis on the spike, comparing it to the grips of the vise. And sure enough, a match. No 2 tools on the planet can make those same exact marks, along with their same exact wear patterns and accidental marks. They knew that vise was used to fashion that metal spike, and with that, they knew Peernock was their man. The pressing matter now was to find him. But before we go on, I want to tell you a little bit about Peernock's girlfriend, Sonia, and her suspected involvement in this case. Later on that day that the crash occurred, investigators attempted to reach Peernock by phone, where they believed him to be residing with Sonia. She said that he was at home, but she'd pass along the message to give them a call when he got back. But when he finally did return the call, he did under the guise of reporting his wife missing. He might have been spooked by the call, knowing that it was going to be in regards to the crash. So he decided to call to report her missing, and that would be his preemptive strike to appear innocent in all of this, supposedly concerned about her whereabouts. Sonia, in the beginning, was very supportive of Peernock. She defended him, and she believed in his innocence, and she even helped him with anything that he needed. However, she did find his absence the night before the crash strange, and she didn't see him all the next day either. It was unusual because he never stayed anywhere else, and there were a few occasions that he would stay over at his soon-to-be ex-wife's house because, you see, they had another younger daughter who would sometimes want him to stay over. Her identity is unknown, and from what I understand, she was close to her dad at the time. And there was a time actually when Natasha was close to her dad too, but her feelings changed as she got older. when his true colors began to bleed through. The younger sister had apparently been shielded through all of this. She wasn't targeted by Peernock. And Sonia didn't think that he had stayed over at Claire's with his daughter because that night of the crash, Peernock's youngest daughter was with her. She seemed to have no idea what Peernock was up to that night. Much of the rest of the next day, Peernock spent draining the bank accounts that he had had with Claire. He had actually had so much money that he needed to withdraw that the bank told him that they did not have enough cash on hand and he'd have to come back the next day. When the couple were informed of the crash by investigators, Peernock was asked to come to the police station to give a statement, and he said that he would. He then told Sonia that he was going to go visit Natasha in the hospital, and that was when he was eventually spotted on surveillance in the hallway and quickly leaving when he saw the guard. He came home and told Sonia that he wasn't allowed to see his daughter. She thought that to be absurd and insisted that he return and demand to see her. But he didn't. The next day, he told Sonia that he was going to try and visit Natasha again and then head over to the police station to take care of giving a statement. But he didn't do that either. Rather, he spent the day getting the rest of his money out of the bank, and then he split town, headed for Vegas. He got a hotel room using an alias and even spent the evening at one of Vegas's world-famous shows. Peernock was officially on the run, and police suspected Sonia was helping him. That's why they were surveilling her. They searched her home several times, and Peernock's youngest daughter was removed from Sonia's care and placed in a temporary foster family. Eventually, there began to be some reported sightings of Peernock back in the Southern California area, and by this time, Natasha had been sent to be taken care of in the home of a friend's family. Well, it just so happened that that home was next door to a home that was for sale, and get this, Peernock actually came to look at that home for sale. While the homeowner was getting the place ready for an open house, she reported that a man matching the description of Peernock stopped by to take a look at the place. He even came inside. But the homeowner noted that he seemed to be acting strange and was exceptionally interested in the view from one particular side of the house. The side of the house that was facing where his daughter was staying. The place where his daughter that he had almost killed. The place where she was recuperating from what he'd done to her. This guy was seriously never going to let this go and just wasn't going to stop at anything. So, knowing Peernock was likely back in the area, investigators decided to turn up the pressure on Sonia. They were tired of playing these games that she and Peernock were playing. They arrested her on charges of aiding and abetting a fugitive wanted for murder. They brought her in for questioning, and they told her that if she didn't cough up some information, she was going to go to jail for a long, long time. It didn't take very long for her to cave. She may have anyway. Despite the fact that she continued to stand by her man, she was beginning to falter in how she felt about his complicity in the murder of his wife. He was insisting to her that he was being framed, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But when he'd vanished for a few weeks and then came back, she had seen that he had had some cosmetic surgery done in order to alter his appearance drastically. Won't stop at anything, right? He kept insisting that he was being set up to take the fall for Claire's murder, and I'm thinking that Sonia just wanted to believe him. But she certainly wasn't going to go to jail for the guy, so on September 4th, 1987, Sonia gave up Peernock's hideout, a local motel. Police rushed over there and placed him under arrest immediately. During the investigation, police had also been contacted by a woman named Victoria Doom, and she had some good information to share with them about her client, Claire Peernock. Yep, I said client. Victoria Doom was Claire's divorce attorney. She told them that Claire came to her office in December of 1986 to file for divorce from Peernock, and he had indeed been served the divorce papers. Their first hearing had been scheduled for January of 1987, but For some reason, Claire called her before the court date to tell Victoria that she wanted to put a hold on the proceedings. Remember, this is related to that so-called contract Peernock asked Claire to sign. She told Victoria that Peernock asked her if she could hold off until August of 1987 because he was in the process of starting up his own business, and a messy divorce would make getting the financials for the business together difficult. He assured her that waiting would be more financially beneficial for everyone, promising that once his business was up and running, he would not contest the divorce in any way. Victoria told Claire to let her look over the agreement before she signed it, and she said that postponing the divorce wouldn't be a problem. She received a copy of the agreement a couple of days later and quickly gave it a once-over, slipping it into Claire's file and then putting Claire's case on the back burner. She wouldn't have really had to worry about it until midsummer. Well, just 1 week before the agreement was to expire, Claire was murdered. And when Victoria found out about it, she rushed over to her files and dug up Claire's, specifically to take a closer look at that contract she had filed away 7 months earlier. Immediately, the timing of Claire's murder alarmed her. The contract she was holding in her hands was set to expire 1 week after Claire's death. It was also on the second look at the contract that the part about promising not to verbally or physically abuse Claire or Natasha jumped out at her too. There was also a promise in there to not get rid of or sell any common property either. This would indeed be very incriminating evidence against Peernock when the time came. Remember how I keep telling you that this guy would stop at nothing? Well, while Peernock was in jail awaiting trial, he was at it again. He was actively soliciting someone to not only kill Natasha, of course, but also Victoria Doom. You've probably come to the conclusion that Peernock here isn't the brightest criminal in the cell block. An inmate to whom Peernock was speaking to about finding someone to kill Natasha and Victoria came forward and alerted one of the corrections officers about Peernock's plan. I'm sure in an effort to get some time shaved off his own particular sentence, however long that was. So the inmate was sent in to speak to Peernock again, but this time he was wearing a wire, and sure enough, there goes Peernock talking about having his daughter and his wife's divorce attorney taken out. Add solicitation of murder to his already lengthy list of charges. Through some creative legal wrangling, and by wrangling I mean having a revolving door of attorneys that he hires and fires, Peernock did not go on trial until October of 1991. Not only did they go through a half a dozen judges, the prosecutor was even replaced one time, something I never recall seeing before. Peernock vehemently denied that he had anything to do with the murder of his wife and the attempted murder of his daughter, despite the fact that his daughter pointed the finger squarely at him. The defense's way of combating her story was to claim that she was incapable of making any reliable identification of the person who'd done this to her because of the massive head injuries she sustained and the fact that she was wearing a mask and the fact that she had been so heavily plied with alcohol and drugs that there was no way her testimony could be taken as fact. But they couldn't really rely on discrediting Natasha alone. They needed to present an alternative theory. This is where his story of being framed was brought about. He claimed that while he was working for the Department of Water Resources in the early 1980s, there was a scam that the department was running. He said that they would perform work and repairs that were set up to fail. So, when equipment or pipes would give out again, they would be called in to complete the work on the repair again, and then they would do shoddy work on purpose in order to be hired again and again. And because this was a department operated by the state, this money was being paid for by taxpayers. Peernock would eventually claim an on-the-job injury and filed for workers' compensation and stopped working. So it was his contention that the Department of Water Resources was out to frame Peernock out of fear that he was going to blow the whistle on their shady money-making schemes, as he claimed that he was writing a book about it, exposing all of them. So in order to prevent him from writing his book, they set him up to take the fall for Claire's murder. He had actually tried to float a couple of different stories, all of them pointing fingers everywhere else but him. He'd even said that Claire and Natasha got into a big fight, that they started drinking and they took the car and crashed. He also claimed that Victoria Doom, one of the detectives on the case, and Natasha got together to conspire against him and frame him for murder so they could take all his money and assets and split it between themselves. He also accused all of his attorneys of conspiring with everyone in the case to make sure that he was convicted. And when I say everyone, I mean everyone. The prosecutor, the DA, all of those judges that he had, all of the investigators on the case, along with every single witness, especially Natasha, of course. When Peernock's latest attorney filed a motion for a continuance again, by then they were 4 years on and into their sixth judge, the prosecutor attempted to shut them down, accusing Peernock and his defense of constantly attempting to find ways to delay the trial through his manipulative tactics. The judge went ahead and granted them this continuance, but he made it very clear that this would not only be the final delay, he ruled that there would be no more changes made to the makeup of the people in this case, meaning the attorney that Peernock had was going to be his final attorney. No more firing anyone. Peernock initially agreed, but of course he would go on to try and fire his most recent attorney, but the judge wasn't having it. He would repeatedly attempt to fire him for the entire duration of the trial, with the judge shutting him down every single time. Just would not stop, right? The prosecutors were able to present a largely circumstantial case against Peernock with all of the things in the case that I've told you about. They also had a parade of witnesses, friends, family, neighbors, Claire's attorney, and especially Natasha, who were all credible when they were speaking of Peernock's state of mind, paranoia, and abuse. There was also Sonia, who, at the onset, initially stood by Peernock. It seemed she was eventually able to look past her feelings for Peernock to see him for what he really was, a liar, a manipulator, and a killer. Either that or she didn't want to get caught up in those aiding and abetting charges looming over her. This was a case that had no fingerprints, blood, or DNA linking Peernock to the crime, but DNA wasn't really a thing quite yet. They did have that vice and that tool mark evidence, that rope, and that damning contract where he had basically admitted, signed and dated, that he was a domestic abuser towards both his wife and his child. Domestic abuse doesn't always mean the abuser has turned killer, but the proof of the abuse and the outrageousness of Claire having a contract with her own husband promising that he would not verbally or physically abuse her or her daughter during that grace period he had requested. I'm certain the implications of that contract were not lost on the jurors. We all are very well aware that most defense attorneys would strongly advise their clients from not taking the stand in their own defense. This can often lead to a scathing cross-examination and could jeopardize the entire case for the defense, especially if their client is unlikable. And I have a feeling that Peernock's attorney didn't think the jury would warm up to him very well. You think? There wasn't anything his attorney was going to be able to say or do that was going to stop him from insisting on taking the stand. There are a number of reasons why a defendant would insist on doing so. I'm sure we've seen several examples. When a defendant is truly innocent, he or she may feel it necessary to take the stand and proclaim it as such. When a defendant claims a killing took place as a result of self-defense, they almost always have to take the stand to explain themselves. But in Peernock's case, I don't think I would be remiss in speculating that not taking the stand for him was simply not an option. To me, he came across as so narcissistic, so controlling, so manipulative, an individual who thought so highly of himself, one who saw himself as the most brilliant person in the room, and he was such a pathological liar, so full of himself that he was certain he could sell all his BS. There was just no way that he wasn't going to try and control the courtroom by taking center stage. Once again, this guy just won't stop. As the prosecutor looked on to the spectacle Peernock was becoming on the stand during direct examination, I can only imagine him chomping at the bit, waiting to have his turn on cross. Peernock came across exactly how you would expect. He was angry. He was antagonistic and hostile. And worst of all, he was openly combative and belligerent with his own attorney. The prosecutor, likely giddy with excitement inwardly, knew that when it was going to be his turn to cross-examine Peernock, he was going to very easily be able to get under this man's skin. And he did. During cross, the prosecutor came at him hard, drilling him with questions to the point where Peernock completely lost control, to the point where the judge had to step in and order a stop to his testimony under cross-examination, and out of the presence of the jury, had Peernock escorted out of the courtroom before he would be allowed to continue. Peernock's testimony was a whole lot of nothing that worked in his favor. He was evasive. He blamed everything on this big conspiracy to frame him, and the jury just wasn't buying it, and they ended up convicting him on all charges. And as for the sentencing hearing, it was a lot of the same behaviors coming from Peernock. He attempted to fire his attorney a couple of more times for good measure. He made all of his usual accusations, the conspiracies against him by everyone, the trial being one-sided and biased. He ranted so much at the court that the judge finally told him that if he didn't shut up and take a seat, he was going to make him, that he allowed him all the liberties through the duration of the trial to ensure that he received a fair trial, but that was over. He was convicted, and the judge did not have to sit here and listen to Peernock's rants anymore. It was time for him to do the listening and be made to face what he had done. But Peernock, again, would not stop. So the judge had him escorted from the courtroom again. But this time, when he was brought back in, his hands were cuffed behind his back and he had duct tape heavily wrapped around his mouth. I'll post a picture of it on social media, just so you can see that I'm not kidding. The judge had some things that he was going to say to Peernock, and he wanted to make sure he knew exactly what he thought of him before he sentenced him. He reminded Peernock that he had murdered his wife, and not only that, he was a man who tried to murder his own daughter, and when his attempt failed, he kept trying by soliciting someone to murder her again from jail, along with his wife's divorce attorney. And guess what else? Word had already made it back to the judge that Peernock had hired the services of a private investigator in order to obtain the names and addresses of all the jurors on his trial. As a matter of fact, a list of everyone on his jury and all of their contact information was discovered in Peernock's jail cell. Just won't ever stop this guy. So, in order to make sure Peernock would never see the light of day again, he sentenced him first for the solicitation of murder of Natasha and Victoria Doom, and then he sentenced him for the attempted murder of Natasha, and finally for the murder of Natasha's mom, Claire. And then the judge ordered those sentences to be served in that order consecutively, just to make sure there was no getting out for Robert Peernock. He is currently incarcerated at R.J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Ysidro, California. Other notable residents at the facility include Tex Watson of the Manson family, Sirhan Sirhan, the man who assassinated presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy, and Eric and Lyle Menendez, the men who shotgunned their parents to death back in 1989. It's been almost 31 years since Natasha's dad murdered her mother and tried to murder her. And despite the fact that her dad will be locked up for the rest of his life, I can imagine, knowing what her dad is capable of, she is likely never really going to be able to stop looking over her shoulder. Peernock is 81 years old now. Do you think he's finally decided it's time to stop? Personally, I doubt it. Even if he is incapable of doing much about it now in his old age, I can very easily see him driving himself mad with his own thoughts and delusions. And I'm going to bring this episode of California Dreaming to a close here for now. But there is more about the story that I am going to bring you a little bit later on in the week, because believe it or not, there is more to tell about Robert Peernock. So I'm kind of going to do the same thing that I did with the last episode on Sandra Cantu and do a follow-up, as I do think it's interesting to note that there is a belief that Peernock is innocent. And to be fair, I do want to explore that side of the story too. So that's something that I will have to prepare for you sometime a little bit later this week, maybe on Tuesday or Wednesday. As always, thank you again for joining me on this very long and twisted story. It was a crazy one, right? My heart goes out to Natasha and her little sister. I would have loved so much for their mom to have made it out of that ordeal with them. I hope they've been able to find some sort of peace and contentment in the years following all of this. Before I sign off, I wanted to remind you that California Dreaming is now proudly a part of the Orbital Jigsaw Network of podcasts. We have joined forces with an excellent group of shows and hosts to bring you a variety of podcasts across several different genres, including The Concession Stand, Busted Wide Open, Super Nerds UK, The Dirty Bits, Historium, Is This Adulting, 401 Film Roast, and our newest addition to the podcast family, Vox Arcana, a Dungeons & Dragons podcast. So if you have the chance, please visit www.orbitaljigsaw.com and check out any of those shows, or visit our blog, or visit the merchandise store. And don't forget to join in the discussion on Facebook on the California Dreaming discussion page. Follow me on Twitter at CaliforniaPod and on Instagram at California Dreaming Pod. Don't forget to refresh your feeds later on this week to look for the addendum to this episode. Thank you so much again for joining me, and until next time, sweet dreams.